Good morning. Good morning, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us today and being part of this growing social movement to mobilise our Australian political leadership, both here at home and internationally, to create a UN Convention on the Rights of Older Persons. My name is Marlene Krasovitsky and I am the Director and Co-Chair of Every Age Counts. May I acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands around the country on which we are meeting today and pay my respects to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander elders, past, present and emerging. I am on the beautiful lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. Before I introduce you to our eminent speakers today, a few words on Every Age Counts, if I may. Now, it has long been acknowledged that ageism is a barrier to older people receiving protections through general human rights provisions. Advocates around the world have been pressing the UN for more than a decade to step up to acknowledge and address ageism and age discrimination as a crucial missing piece in human rights instruments and protections. Every Age Counts is Australia's coalition and grassroots campaign to end ageism directed at older people. And that's why we are so proud to host this webinar today. Every Age Counts has many thousands of individual supporters and many organisational members across a broad range of sectors. And I'm very pleased to say numbers in both groups grow daily. Our organisational members include the Benevolent Society, the Australian Human Rights Commission, Council on the Ageing Australia, National Seniors, Federation of Ethnic Communities, councils, and many other peaks, service providers, researchers and advocates. Since we began in 2018, we have argued that a human rights approach is crucial to understanding and ending ageism. And we spelled this out, for example, in our numerous submissions to the Royal Commission into Aged Care Quality and Safety, and made a number of recommendations to address this, including Australian support for a UN Convention on the Rights of Older Persons. And of course, all of us, unfortunately, have witnessed the exacerbation of ageism and human rights violations against older people during the pandemic. So we at Every Age Counts are stepping up our action around this issue, which brings me to our wonderful speakers today. I will give you just brief introductions. Please refer to people's fuller bios on our website. Andrew Burns will be our first keynote speaker. Andrew is Emeritus Professor of International Law and Human Rights in the Faculty of Law and Justice at the University of New South Wales. For our panel discussion, we are then joined by Julie Biles, who is the head of the International Longevity Centre Australia and co-president of the International Longevity Centre Global Alliance. Bill Mitchell is the principal solicitor, Townsville Community Law Incorporated, and Craig Gear is the CEO of the Older Persons Advocacy Network. Our second keynote speaker will be Robert Tickner. Robert is the co-chair of Every Age Counts and may be well known to you as a long-standing human rights advocate. May I welcome all of our speakers today. Before we start, just to some housekeeping, just a reminder that this session is being recorded and the recording will be available after the webinar on our website. Secondly, please post your questions and comments in the chat. We'll be keeping a very close eye on the chat and we'll get to as many questions as we can during our Q&A session, which will be around 11:05. Also, just a heads up that Craig Gear will need to leave us at around 11:20. So if you have some questions specifically for Craig, we'll make sure we can get to them before Craig needs to leave us. So to our first presentation, to Andrew Burns to give our first keynote address. Andrew, a convention on the rights of older person has been on the drawing board for well over a decade now, gaining little traction at the UN or internationally. Has that changed and why? And how real is the opportunity at the international level now to have a convention created? Andrew.
Thanks very much, Marlene, and thank you for the opportunity to participate in this webinar and address some of those questions. I congratulate Every Age Counts for giving this issue the profile that it really deserves. And I too am joining the webinar from Gadigal land, and I pay my respects to their elders as well. In response to your question, I think I'm going to answer 4 different questions in the few minutes that I have. The first is, what are we talking about when we talk about a new convention? Secondly, why does it matter? Thirdly, and picking up on your question directly, where have we got to? And then what needs to happen next, and what can we individually and collectively do to make it happen? So my basic position is that the development of a new treaty on older persons' rights would bring benefits to Australians, old and young, and that the Australian government has the real potential to add decisive momentum to the current United Nations process, which is at a critical stage. And accordingly, we as Australian civil society organisations need to call on government to take active and decisive steps immediately. So breaking those down a little bit. First, what are we talking about? A new treaty, or a convention as it's called, on the human rights of older persons will be an international agreement between countries negotiated at the United Nations. And under that agreement, the countries that sign on will agree to take various steps, legislative, financial, policy, administrative, to protect and ensure rights guaranteed to older persons in that treaty. That agreement will be binding under international law. We already have treaties dealing with racial discrimination, sex discrimination, the rights of persons with disabilities, and the rights of the child, among others. But we have no treaty that comprehensively and coherently addresses the human rights of older persons or human rights in older age. Of course, we know that human rights that apply generally to all human beings apply to older persons as well. But the problem with those treaties is that they generally don't directly address the issues of particular concern to many older persons. And recent United Nations studies have clearly shown that in practice, these other treaties are simply not doing the job. Older persons are largely or completely invisible in the work of those treaties and their supervisory bodies. So, as you said already, the call went out more than a decade ago from human rights advocates and older persons' rights advocates for the international community to step up and close this huge gap in the international protection of human rights. So I'll speak in a moment about where we've got to. But secondly, why does it matter? How would a new treaty help us in improving the human rights of older persons? Something agreed in New York and Geneva and out there. My view is that, and there's plenty of evidence to support this, that a new treaty would be helpful not only to us as Australians, but it would also help to protect human rights in older age in other countries where protections presently fall below even the flawed protections that we have in this country. So a new human rights treaty would consist of a comprehensive and coherent catalogue of civil, political, economic, social and cultural rights. It would provide a framework that governments and the community could use to design and evaluate laws, policies and programs against human rights standards. And these human rights standards, newly articulated, would reflect a deep understanding of the nature and extent of ageism, the social construction of ageing, and the specific systemic and structural violations of human rights which older persons experience. Features which are lacking both in our domestic legal system and protection at the international level. We know that human rights treaties can and do have an impact at the national, state, and even local government level. We've seen the impact that the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities has had in Australia. And we saw during the Royal Commission into the Quality and Safety of Aged Care that what the absence of a corresponding treaty meant for the Commission trying to develop a robust set of human rights-based recommendations for our future aged care system. They floundered. It would make a difference if we had a new convention, because we would then have a clear statement of values, a new policy framework that was coherent, a legal framework and an advocacy tool. So where we got to international. Following the call a decade or so ago to start work on a new convention, the United Nations General Assembly set up a working group to examine the issue and to try and come up with some specific recommendations as the next steps. That body, its long name is too long to mention, let's call it the Open-Ended Working Group on Ageing, has now met for 12 substantive sessions. It's been a long haul for anyone who's been there the whole time. Progress has been very slow, but positive, and it's stalled at various stages along the way. And the major reason for this slow progress is that there's not yet a sufficiently large number of states which have come out in support of a new convention. Many are still sitting on the fence, waiting for someone else to move, and then they'll perhaps come on board and engage constructively. But recently, at the latest session of the working group in April this year, there was some movement. A number of states have proposed a procedural initiative to try and break the deadlock. They proposed setting up what's called a, quote, cross-regional core group of states, end quote, to prepare the ground for the open-ended working group to set up another group in April 2023, a subgroup. And that subgroup is going to be asked to prepare a draft text determining once again the main gaps in the international human rights system for older persons, which would then be form the basis of subsequent discussions. You might think that's rather elaborate and complex, and Byzantine indeed it is. It's all rather frustrating, a bit of a dispiriting combination of the least common denominator that we often see in international diplomacy and, yes, minister ingenuity in an attempt to move things forward. And there's a real danger that even this initiative might be thwarted. But at the moment, it's all we've got at the international level, and it is an advance, and therefore we need to try and make it work as CSOs and through our government. Thus far, Australia has not supported a new convention. It's been fairly negative. It's expressed the view that existing treaties are adequate and that better implementation of existing norms is all that's needed. Government articulated this view first 10 years ago, and it has not been prepared to revisit it, despite the mounting evidence, the overwhelming evidence to the contrary. It's a view that simply cannot be sustained in light of the evidence of the last 10 years brought before the open-ended working group and contained in recent studies by the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner of Human Rights and in the reports of the United Nations Independent Expert on the Rights of Older Persons. It's true that the Australian government has responded on some occasions to requests from the open-ended working group for written information, as has the Human Rights Commission. Australia has also been present at open-ended working group sessions and made some statements, but overall it's kept a relatively low profile. It hasn't actively engaged in advancing the substantive discussion, in moving the process forward, either at the public sessions or behind the scenes. That needs to change. Okay then, finally, what needs to happen next and what can we do to make it happen? We have, I think, reached a critical stage in the struggle to achieve a convention. There's a real danger that if the latest initiative doesn't bear fruit, the project will be derailed for another generation. Accordingly, we need to call on our government to act. Whatever the outcome of the election this week, those who want to see better protection of the human rights of older persons will need to get in touch urgently with the incoming government. From the Prime Minister through the Attorney General, the Minister for Foreign Affairs, and the other relevant ministers, as well as with their local members. We need them to push them to support this initiative. There are three specific things that I think that we need the Australian government, our representatives, after all, to do urgently. First, to express publicly Australia's unequivocal support for the development of a new treaty on the human rights of older persons. Second, to get actively involved immediately in the informal intersessional discussions around the new initiative which are taking place in New York and Geneva, and in particular concerning what the open-ended working group will do at its 2023 session. And finally, as part of that engagement, to support the establishment of a smaller working group of the open-ended working group and charging it with the task of preparing the draft provisions of a treaty for discussion and finalisation by the open-ended working group as a whole, and ultimately by the General Assembly, preferably within 3 years. We need to set a target. We need to set concrete actions to achieve that target within a reasonable timeline. It's up to us. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Andrew. Thank you for that clarity. Thank you for that overview. And thank you for reminding us that this is a critical moment in time and a critical stage. So it is up to all of us. So now it's my great pleasure to introduce you to our panel. Julie, Bill and Craig, thank you for being here today and for your ongoing work and advocacy in this area. Thank you. So Julie, may I start with you? Andrew's touched on this, but tell us a little more about why a specific UN Convention on Older Persons' Rights is needed.
Yes, certainly. So as Andrew said, that everyone has rights under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but and they actually say in there that they apply without distinction on the basis of race, race, colour, sex, and a whole lot of other things. But no, there's no specific protection on the basis of age. So it begs the question, why don't we have a convention on the rights of older people? It's not to say that older people have different rights, but it recognises that older people may require specific protection of their universal rights. And what it also requires, and I think this is one of the reasons why people might balk at it, is it requires reporting against the convention to show how people's rights are protected. So I don't think anybody has any concern about having a convention and understanding what the rights are, but what they do have a concern about is what that might cost in terms of reporting against it. But I don't see that as a cost. I see that as a gain, because it puts down in code what we value as a society about our older people. So some of the protections that we get for older people would be protection of dignity and autonomy, security against cruel, inhuman or degrading treatment, including elder abuse, social security, education, work, and standards of living adequate for the health and well-being, including food, clothing, housing, and medical care and necessary social services. So as Andrew said, that we've had, Australia's had some engagement in the open-ended working group on ageing, and we have quite an enthusiastic engagement from civil society. But in 2012, we had Susan Ryan, the then Age Discrimination Commissioner of Australia, and she discussed particularly discriminatory attitudes and workforce barriers, and arguing the need for older workforce in Australia. And of course, those needs haven't changed, but we need an older workforce, not just for older people, but for our own selves, for our aged care, to run our health systems and to teach our children, among other roles. She called for aged health care reforms. Those needs haven't changed. She emphasised the need to improve financial literacy of older persons and extended protections to older persons on the grounds of sexual orientation and gender identity. Now, we also can argue that Australia has some exemplary practices which show that we are leading the way in terms of protecting the rights of older persons, including having an Age Discrimination Commissioner, Age Discrimination Act, an Aged Care Act. And we've seen a lot of action in this area, reforms to aged care diversity framework. We've got the pension, protections through Medicare, PBS, public hospitals, and now since 2019, a national plan to respond to the abuse of older Australians. So we do have a lot of policy and community interest in the rights of older people, but we find that around 27% of people over 50 report experiencing age discrimination at work. And people might be working longer, but that's mainly the people who have higher levels of education. And many older people are working less than they want to, particularly past age 55. Housing prices have risen substantially, and that has implications for older people, and fewer will own their own homes outright. There's very high demand for social housing and very low availability. Homelessness is increasing, particularly among older women. Despite universal healthcare, a lot of people can't afford healthcare because of out-of-pocket costs and have unmet healthcare needs. And we've had yet another inquiry into the aged care in the form of the Royal Commission, with 8 volumes of insights and 148 recommendations. And the interim report was parsimoniously called Neglect, whereas the final report was more optimistically entitled Care, Dignity and Respect. So there's a lot of ways in which we could improve what we do for older people. We could talk about them more, but I think Australia can take a leadership role in the protection of the rights of older persons. And we've made many advances in recognising, understanding and meeting the needs of older people, including insights into what doesn't work and where we can do better.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Julia. Very, very compelling case. Thank you. So, Bill, if I could come to you now, where does Australia stand on a UN Convention on the Rights of Older Persons? What's been our stance on the creation of the conventions and on other conventions, sorry, and where have we stood on this one so far? Are there any barriers to Australia championing this convention? Sorry, Bill, you're on mute.
You'd think I'd be.
That's it.
I'm still not, obviously. Can I pay my respects to the Gurrumbilbara, Walgarukaba, Bindal, Nuwagi and Gugu Baden peoples? They're the traditional custodians of the land and waters in the Townsville region. I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and I also acknowledge that those lands and waters were never ceded. I think it's important to give a background to the Open-Ended Working Group, and there's been a decade of meetings. During that time, only 53 member states of 193 member states have made public statements in support of the convention, and that's either in the working group, in a joint statement, or before the Human Rights Council. Unfortunately, Australia is not one of those 52 states. It doesn't actually mean that all remaining states have made public statements opposing a convention. They haven't. Sadly, Australia is one of those member states that has made public statements opposing a convention. While I say this, Australia's engagement has been so poor that their opposition has remained on a low level. It's been barely noticed by anyone other than those who are looking out for it. So let's look briefly at Australia's engagement with the convention debate in the Open-Ended Working Group. Remembering this working group was established by the General Assembly on the 21st of December 2010. So we're now in its 12th year. Australia's Human Rights Commission, as noted earlier, was engaged during early sessions, including the Age Discrimination Commissioner Susan Ryan's role as a panellist before the third session in 2012. And in fact, prior to the 8th session, national human rights institutions did not have a right of participation beyond inclusion as a panel speaker. Australian civil society accreditations by the third session included CODA Australia, CODA Victoria, CODA South Australia, the Brotherhood of St Lawrence and Benetas. My own NGO, Community Legal Centres Australia, came into the debate between the third and fourth sessions. Prior to the fourth session, we had very constructive conversations with government, but a federal election intervened, a change of government altered the dynamic, and it certainly changed the narrative here at home. The Australian government's narrative has not shifted since. Since the fourth session, Australia's engagement with the Open-Ended Working Group has been weak and inconsistent. First to their statements to the Open-Ended Working Group, then I'll look at their inputs on the topics of substance. So Australia has actually appeared infrequently, made very few statements, and provided limited submissions. It has appeared twice to defend accreditation applications on day one of the working group, but on both occasions failed to make any statements in the forum itself on days 2 to 4. Australian NHRIs and NGOs have made significant numbers of statements and inputs since the first session. My own organisation has made 25 interventions before 9 sessions of the working group and has submitted substantive and normative inputs on key issues, both by itself and as a part of a smaller informal expert working group. As Andrew has mentioned, Australia's statements on the convention mirror most of those we see from the opponents of the convention. That is to suggest that there are no human rights protection gaps for older persons, that what is needed is better implementation and use of existing treaties such as CRPD, or of reporting mechanisms such as the Universal Periodic Review. There are concerns that a new convention would bring up problems of treaty proliferation, thematic duplication and overlap. And of course, the old bugbear that a new convention would mean compliance costs and financial burdens for the UN, but also more implicitly for member states. Australia's record on inputs has also been limited. Issues for substantive and normative input was set at the 7th session, and I think Australia's provided inputs to the 8th and 12th sessions, completely ignoring the 9th, 10th and 11th sessions altogether. So how does this compare to Australia's historical approach to treaty making? Australia suggests that its commitment to human rights is enduring. We were an original signatory to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. Importantly, Evatt served as President of the UN General Assembly from 48 to 49 and helped draft the Universal Declaration. And we, like New Zealand, are very proud of our role in developing norms like CRPD. But why not now? And there are many barriers I think I can identify. The key ones are we are still facing embedded ageism and relative invisibility of older persons. There is, of course, a lack of political will, which really stems from a lack of political advocacy, at least to an extent that engenders political will. There are some traditional UN voting blocs and groups that are problematic. And there's also been a historic absence of interest in the Western Pacific, despite support from various countries, including Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, Vietnam, and possibly now South Korea. But I think overwhelmingly, the key barrier is we've all been far too nice, too much civil society. Let me briefly mention some opportunities.
Sorry, Bill, I'm going to have to cut you short there. Unless you can do it in 30 seconds.
I can do it in 30 seconds.
Okay.
The core regional group that Andrew mentioned is definitely something that the Australian government must be pushed to participate in. Secondly, they must be pushed to engage very strongly with the Human Rights Council's processes in Geneva. And of course, last but not least, we have an election around the corner, and that will provide us with a huge opportunity in my view. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bill. Thank you. So to you now, Craig. Nowhere during the pandemic has the denial of human rights of older people been more obvious, sadly, than in aged care. What difference would a UN Convention on the Rights of Older Persons make to aged care?
Yeah, thanks. And I've got the privilege also of coming to you today from the land of the Gadigal people, the Eora Nation, and thank you to Aboriginal elders who bring your culture, your land, and the privilege and gift that it is to be on your land today. We can all say, yes, older people's rights are human rights and human rights are older people's rights. But the problem is that the aged care sector, the model that we have in aged care, treats older people as passive recipients of care. It assumes vulnerability and it perpetuates this model of denial of choice and opportunity. And this is what part of the problem is, that we don't have something to frame and hang those positive aspects of ageing off. And that's effectively is ageism. And the Royal Commission on Quality and Safety did see that during the COVID pandemic, and it was the reason why they did an interim report, not just on the neglect, but also about COVID specifically and what they saw happening, which was effectively constraints and restrictions that were above and beyond what everyone else in society was going through. The fact that I could still go out and go to a picnic at times, but the person who was living in a residential aged care facility, for reasons of work health and safety and some good reasons that providers were trying to keep people protected, but they weren't allowed to say the same citizens' rights that I had. Now, how can we be in a society in Australia where that's allowed to happen? The current Aged Care Act is really about funding and the operations of the Act. It's not about the human rights or the older person being at the centre of it. And I'm really pleased that we are moving towards putting human rights into the Aged Care Act, putting the older person front and centre where they should be. But the problem is, it's really hard to hook that off international treaties. While there is some things there like the CRPD, the problem is, again, it's about disability. It's not about those positive, engaging community connection, citizenship, autonomy rights that all older people, all people should have. And so that's why we need this international convention to really change that power relationship, that power dynamic between the aged care system, between society and for older people, to say that you are still connected to your community. You have the right to choice and autonomy. You have the right to live free of abuse and neglect. You have the right to live free of chemical and physical restraint. You have the right to be part of the decision-making, a part of your life. That's supported decision-making, and that absolutely has to frame. So we've seen the difference having disability framed, where it then starts to say, I am still a citizen in this society. I still live my life. I'm still part of Australia. We need that for older people as well. We need something that shifts the dynamic. And while there says there's other treaties around, those general right treatments do not give you the right to care and support or independence in your old age. And that's what older people are telling us that they absolutely want. They're not being brought in to keep making decisions even when they still have capacity. We need to enshrine that. This will help inform the human rights that will go into this new Aged Care Act. It will be working in tandem with that. There's things that we can do now that this will strengthen that. We have a Charter of Aged Care Rights that OPAN and our 9 members are so passionate about, but it's not legislated. It doesn't have that. So the fact that I can't actually say you're breaching my human rights, and there's issues around how we can actually deal with that and have that listened to and rectified, that's a problem. This UN convention starts to propagate down that as a framework that will help that to happen. But older people are going to have to be part of the design of this as well. They need to be consulted on this. It needs to be their movement and their convention, not just ours as well. We'll come along beside them and support them, but their voice needs to be in this as well. So it's exciting, but it is something. And if the Australian government was to make this statement about the UN convention, it would make a huge difference about the power dynamics and the respect for older people and the dignity they deserve in Australia.
Indeed. Thank you so much, Craig. Thank you. And thank you to all of the panel. It is my great privilege to now go to our second keynote speaker, Robert Tickner, who is the co-chair of Every Age Counts. Now, Robert, you have an eminent and long-standing record of involvement in and achievement in human rights across a range of fields. In your view, what is needed to galvanise Australia at all levels into action to become a key player in the creation and implementation of this convention? What are the priority actions we need?
Marlene, thank you for your excessively warm and generous introduction, which is most undeserved, but particularly thanks to the speakers for setting us on a course for a very productive discussion this morning. I think the first thing that I would say is what a wonderful thing it is at this particular time to introduce this quite inspirational topic into our conversation today. We shouldn't be ashamed of the fact that we're trying to do something here which is all about taking the world to a better place. And sometimes that seems almost impossible to achieve. But the fact is that movements of people, whether it be the women of the world, people with disabilities, Indigenous people, there are so many examples of where the community, through civil society, through organised action, have literally helped change the world for the better. And frankly, that's exactly what we need to do now if we're going to achieve this convention. There's a lot of mythology around and a lot of misunderstanding about how the processes work to achieve an international convention, new on the landscape of the international human rights agenda. In some ways, based on my experience, it's a very real process, a very grounded, very earthy process. I've had the privilege to watch the work of Indigenous people, which played such an absolute driving and pivotal role in achieving the International Convention on the Rights of the World's Indigenous People. Moving outside the realm of direct human rights to the wider humanitarian agenda, the work of ICAN, the International Campaign Against Nuclear Weapons, with Red Cross and other organisations, literally was the driving force that helped create the international treaty to outlaw nuclear weapons. And of course, ICAN received the Nobel Peace Prize for that. So my message to you is, do not underestimate the power of organised people, men and women of goodwill around the world rallying to achieve a new international human rights standard. And so the first thing we have to do is to get an unequivocal, strong endorsement from the relevant policy minister. So that's the minister responsible for ageing, but perhaps a senior minister, and both ministers, if there be two, in any future government, we don't know yet, and have that minister become a champion of this new convention, because that of itself will help bring on board other departments like Attorney Generals and Foreign Affairs. We need our champion for our sector and for the cause that we represent. So we need to beat a path to the door. Now, in the lead up to this webinar, Every Age Counts has engaged with both sides of politics in relation to this international convention. And we've got replies from both sides. They're relatively modest replies. Both of them talk about strong commitment to respect the rights of older persons and all the predictable things you'd expect. And we thank them for that. The opposition has gone a little further in saying they are prepared to engage with civil society in relation to the work of the open-ended working group. And we will certainly want to take that up should they form the government. If they don't, obviously, as always, we're strictly non-party political. We work with people from all sides. we'll take it up with the coalition should they be returned to government as well. But the point is this, that the work of an individual country like Australia, as has already been said, in the United Nations through strong leadership, as Dr. Everett showed and other ministers have shown over many years, sometimes from both sides of politics, that Australia, if it holds up its head, if it shows the leadership and the vision for a better world, can literally be a transformative force for good in the international community. Now, we shouldn't have any illusions that this convention, if it comes to pass, will of its own account just have a snap transformation of the rights of older people. These are slow processes to develop. We wish they're faster and we'll drive it as hard as we can, but they are slow processes to get the convention. And we also need to get ultimately that convention in force within Australia. But may I say this to conclude, it's not just for Australia that we're doing this, it's for older people right around the world, because it's true to say that most countries don't have the existing human rights protections that Australia has. But we want to build on those for ourselves, but we also want to have that strong international support for a convention which not only sets in place new international norms, but lifts the whole conversation around ageing. It transforms thinking because it becomes part of the new international order of human rights and gives increased prominence to rights that, as our speakers have said, have otherwise been neglected. So I say to people in conclusion, well, let's make a bit of history. Let's get behind this. There's going to be a number of events and initiatives taking place in coming months. Every Age Council will set up some communication with others to make sure that individuals are involved as well as organisations, and give you some concrete actions you can take down the track to talk to our new government, whoever that might be. Thanks, Marlene.
Thank you, Robert, and thank you to all of our speakers today for outlining the case, compelling as it is, and for giving us the inspiration to take this forward. Very grateful to all of you. But now it's over to you. And as predicted, the questions have been coming in thick and fast. So the panel's coming back. All of our speakers are coming back onto the screen. But I'm going to go to you, Craig, first, because we know you have to leave. A question to you, Craig, from Anne. How do we tackle the lack of political will and build a sense of urgency and possibility around this?
Yeah, I think the problem is that people don't see it from the perspective of walking in a person's shoes who's experiencing ageism or experiencing a lack of supported decision making, of assumptions on their life that they cannot no longer live their life, or that their autonomy and place in society is being taken away. So I think there is power in older people speaking for themselves and telling those stories of their lives, but about what they expect from society, and that starts to frame up why we need something that actually gives those protections. So we need to be going and speaking to all members of Parliament. We need to be speaking to our neighbours as well to understand that older people who live down the street, who are part of our community, are absolutely a vital, vibrant part of our society, and we need to listen to them, and we need to hear that they don't want to be put in the corner.
Indeed, indeed. And Craig, if you need to disappear and we don't get a chance to say thank you on behalf of all of us here today for your participation today. Okay, we've got a question for Bill. Bill, what is the state of play on support or otherwise for a convention at the state and territory government level? Is there room for political pressure on the federal government from these other jurisdictions?
That's a great question. In fact, I did a presentation to West Australian government last year sometime, and there was strong interest in Western Australia around the issue. I suspect it's a completely untapped resource. Now, given that states and territories are parties to conventions through their involvement with the Commonwealth, it's also in their interests to understand what their obligations might be, and in fact to respect their want to comply with obligations. Can I also say there is a more complex issue there, that we don't have coverage of human rights laws in Australia. We need a federal charter of human rights. We only have state laws in the ACT, Victoria and Queensland. But if you can do it in Queensland, you can do it anywhere, in my view. So there's a bigger picture at play, but this is very much an untapped resource for us. I think we need to pursue.
Thank you, Bill. Andrew, a question from Janet. If we're all being too nice, what do you suggest is a constructive and creative approach to advocating for change?
Well, I think it was Bill who suggested that we're being too nice, but I think
okay.
I think perhaps sometimes we are. Look, I think we just need we need to organise, as I think there is now a momentum to do it, and I think as a result of this webinar, I hope that there will be there have been some discussions about perhaps getting together in a loose coalition, and if we can do that, the more voices that the politicians hear, the more they will realise that it is an issue amongst the electorate, and that's, unless we get a champion working totally on his or her own, on their own initiative, we're going to have to push them to do it. And so we all need to be getting in touch with them and doing what other lobby groups do, using whatever avenues of communication from the grassroots up to the highest level to let them know that we want action and that sitting on their hands is not an adequate response from the Australian community's perspective.
I do like James's comment there about older people should go on strike. That would be would be lovely to see. Yeah.
What an impact that would have. Now, Bill, given that you were the one, that made that comment, is there anything you'd just like to add to Andrew's response there? You're on mute, Bill.
Yes, it's not my opinion. In fact, the research done by Andrew's colleague and by Andrew, Annie Herro of UNSW, shows that in fact civil society's response to the convention has not been as forceful as other places or other themes or areas. So it's a strong message to us that whilst we've been working hard, we obviously need to do more. We need to do more to mobilise. And I think what Craig said about making sure that older persons are as involved in this process as they can be, particularly those who are the most invisible: older Indigenous people, older people living with dementia, living in institutional care. They've also got to have a voice in this, and that's a barrier in itself, because we know that that those people are even more invisible.
Indeed, indeed. Thank you. Julie, a question for you from Daniela. What is the relationship between the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disability and a new convention for older people?
So I think it's been said that that the rights of people with disability and the rights of older people do intersect, particularly if older people have disability. However, at the moment, we actually sort of think about, we actually put a chronological age divide between people with disability who are serviced under the National Disability Insurance Scheme and older people who are serviced, their needs are met supposedly under the Aged Care Act and the aged care system. So we already put that divide there. So we already say they're different. So, but the other thing I think is really important to recognise is that the diversity, sorry, I've got a 2-year-old here who won't leave the room, the diversity of older people, and that while ageing is universal, if we live long enough, we're ageing by definition. It's not uniform. So we also need to emphasise that ageing is a journey through life, and protections are not just about pensions and disability and aged care and protections from elder abuse, although those are all very important. But it's also about older people's rights to autonomy, recognition, participation, and realisation as full citizens with full entitlements to all rights. So this is why it's same but different. So there will be some similarities.
Indeed, thank you. And thank you for reminding us that this is across the generations.
That's right.
We are indeed all getting older. So this is not just about the current cohort of older people, but for future generations.
I'm demonstrating the
You are indeed.
working grandparenting. Yeah.
Indeed. Good on you. We do have a question for you, Robert, but I'm going to come to Craig first because he needs to go. Craig, a question from Sylvia. Is there a dedicated avenue for the voice of older people from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds so that their voices can be heard?
Yeah, I think as Bill was talking about there, another group that possibly does not have the strength of voice, and we need to work harder that all these different groups are equally heard, and that intersectionality is looked at of older people's voices as well. The Federation of Ethnic Community Councils of Australia do a great job of bringing through those voices. But working in FECA, being a member of Every Age Counts, I think is really, really important. But I think we can all do more. It's something that we're looking at in our organisations, our members, looking at the diversity of voices that come through our reference groups, through people that we put forward as well. One of the great initiatives is a Council of Elders that does have diverse voices within the Council of Elders. That's the first time we've had that in Australia, and they're older people speaking for themselves and people from culturally diverse backgrounds who are members of that as well. And they will go out and bring forward the voices. They've just started, so we've got to let them get their traction. But I'm really hopeful that they will bring avenues for community to bring up to the council their views, including culturally diverse views as well.
Thank you, Craig. And I guess following on a little bit from that, Robert, Sylvie asks about whether there's an umbrella group for advocacy groups around this issue.
I don't think there's one umbrella group. I do think, however, that if I can make the point, the absolute critical thing is that we really build the collaboration and the organisation among all the NGOs and advocacy organisations speaking with one voice in support of this convention coming into existence. And I think that a key objective we ought to have with the new government, it's a very reasonable one, and that is that the incoming minister responsible for ageing and the senior person in the portfolio, and both if there are two, together with the Attorney General and the Minister for Foreign Affairs of the incoming government, really should have a high-level working group roundtable with organisations across the sector. I mean, it's 2022 to ask our national government to engage with civil society around a key issue like this is hardly a radical ask. It's almost common courtesy that with so many people committed to this issue, setting up a dialogue with government surely is the least we can expect. So I would make that a high priority of the incoming government. And I guess I'd also say as well that we must not neglect public communication. We need to explain this issue to the public. It's absolutely no threat to anyone. I believe, as does the Age Discrimination Commissioner, Kay Patterson, I believe that this convention formulation is an opportunity for Australia to shine. We've made so many contributions to the world around human rights. We haven't got an impeccable track record by any means, but when we're good, we're really good. We can bring out the best in people, we can bring nations together and show that leadership in the international community that makes Australians proud, and we can do it here.
Hear, hear, absolutely. Craig's leaving us now. Thank you again, Craig. I'm just keeping an eye on the chat. An interesting comments come through that I'll actually ask each of you to have a comment on if you wish. The question or the observation is, what can we do when the biggest barrier around this is our internalised ageism? How do we make this an issue out there and proud when we're all, dealing with our own internalised ageism? Any comments from the panel?
I mean, look, I'll jump in and say we don't actually have a national framework, plan or policy on ageism. And that would be a great starting point. This is just another example of invisibility of people who are already aging. But of course, the denial that people have that they will age and have the privilege of aging needs to be addressed. So I think we do need to tackle this as an intergenerational, all of government, national policy. And that's a starting point, in my view.
Thank you, Bill.
I guess I'm prepared to chip in and add a bit. I mean, I think this is a work in progress. We need to understand that we have to work at these issues over a sustained period of time. I know, throughout my adult lifetime, I mean, think about the fundamental transformation that's occurred, in relation to the rights of women and dealing with issues of sexism. When these issues were first raised, they were anything but commonly held, standards and beliefs around the rights of women. And people had to fight long and hard to bring about change. I remember when I started working at the Aboriginal Legal Service, there used to be a national paper that used to circulate with a racist joke every week, and it was focused on Aboriginal people. I mean, that happened, in the early 1970s. And we've seen great transformations. It is true that we need to deal with these issues, but we should take heart, be confident of what we're doing, be systematic in our advocacy, and build the strength of our campaign over time. But of course, it is an impediment to achieving our goals, but it's a transformation, a shift in Australian society in thinking about the rights of older people. So, in a way, we're kind of trailblazers on this, and sometimes we'll be unpopular, but given the fact that every political party, supported legislation to make age discrimination illegal in Australia, and we do have at least the nominal support of all sides of politics and minor parties, we start from a pretty good base.
We do indeed. Thank you. Okay, if there are no other comments from the panel, I'll just...
I think...
Oh, sorry, Julie?
I think Andrew and I both had something to say on this. So whether Andrew wants to go first or me. Okay, so look, just before I make my formal comment, I just want to say, before this meeting, I had a cup of coffee up the street with the two grandkids up there, and I sat next to a table of about, I think 12, 15, didn't count them, Greek men, older Greek men, and they were having a fabulous time. So, that's what we want to see. That's what we want to see, people able to go out, participate and have relationships and chat and grow and be real people. But look, I think I wanted to say something, and I cut my speech short, but what I want to say is exactly on this point, that this is why we need a convention on the rights of older people, because older people don't even know what their place in society is. We haven't framed that in any way, except perhaps in terms of, and even worse during COVID, vulnerability and needing protection. And so, the Commission did recommend information and education programs to ensure older people are aware of their rights. Well, we don't even know what they are, but that is important. We need to help older people understand their rights and their needs and know how to access and benefit from help, know how to age well. And we need to overcome that endemic and internalized ageism, which has older people avoiding preventive activities, avoiding care that would help them maintain well-being in older age, because they don't want to be a bother. I don't know how many times I've heard that, but I'm sure we've all heard it. And just further, we introduced a thing called consumer-directed care with great pride and great badge. And it's great because consumers in Australia do have rights. But we didn't focus on providing the consumers in this case with the literacy and skills to exercise those rights. And, if Craig was here, I'm sure he'd agree, that's a massive gap in our aged care system. So rant over, sorry.
Thank you. Thank you, Julie. Andrew, did you want to add something to that? Because we're going to have to wrap up soon.
Yes, I mean, look, I mean, it's huge cultural change that we're talking about, in terms of ageism and all the structures that are involved. And I think the others have said it very clearly. I mean, I think just a couple of things that have come up. I think the question of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities is an important one. There are questions of self-identification of older people, particularly those who acquire disability later in life, that raise quite tricky issues. But in terms of a new convention, I think the baseline must be nothing less than the CRPD and perhaps more. I think that's got to be the starting point. What the implications of that are for things like deinstitutionalisation, I think, are very interesting. They were not explored by the Royal Commission, for example. You know, should we be thinking more creatively, and some places are. And I think the other point that's been very well made by a number is the need to think of it not just as being about human rights of older persons. This is about a human rights-based approach to ageing. All ages, life course approaches, and also the fact that sometimes where people don't identify as older persons, they would understand being discriminated against on the basis of older age or stereotypes of older age that are imputed to them. So I think we also need to bring that in so that we understand that that it's not necessarily an identification of a membership of a group for all purposes, although sometimes that would be appropriate. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Look, thank you very much, Andrew, and thank you to all of the panel for addressing the questions that have been flying in. Unfortunately, we won't get to all of them, but there have been some very interesting questions and comments around the world of work and also the language that we use. So, but I'm also pleased to see that there's been exchange within the chat and people have been exchanging ideas, contacts, information, and so on. So obviously, this is not the end of the conversation. This is just another conversation that we hope to have continuing. So look, it's up to me really now just to wrap up and thank again our panel speakers, our keynote speakers for your contributions today. Thank you for outlining the very, very compelling case that we have before us. Our human rights do not diminish as we age. And yet, despite knowing this, it's clear that we haven't done enough yet to effectively protect the human rights of older people. And today we've heard the compelling case from advocates who've been long-standing change makers in this area. But we can't leave it just to them. It's time for all of us to step up, to put pressure on our political leadership to proactively support a UN Convention on the rights of older persons. We have a good track record in this country, but now's the time to push a convention on the rights of older persons. It's time for action to strengthen and protect the human rights of older people. So we've heard a number of very practical actions put on the table today as to how we might advance this agenda. For our part, please keep an eye on our website and in your inbox. We'll be setting up, as Robert said, communications to update you and our wider Every Age Counts supporter base on the outcomes of today and also future developments in this space. We will certainly be seeking meetings with the incoming national government, whether it's new or returned government, and key ministers, because without their support, the road's going to be a little longer and a little tougher. And of course, we'll continue to advocate and speak publicly about this and work towards getting the government to convene a roundtable dialogue with civil society and other stakeholders. So please watch this space, please get involved, please be a part of this growing movement. If I may, just a couple of very practical suggestions as well. We do have a petition on our website, which is everyagecounts.org.au, Human Rights Petition. Please sign up to that petition. We will also in the next couple of weeks put a model letter, if you like, on our website for organisations or for individuals to send to your MPs. There's a little noise around at the moment and we don't want your letters to get lost. So we're not putting them up just now, but we will do so in a couple of weeks. So please keep an eye on the website. We'll put up this draft letter that you can customise, play around with, put your logo on and so on, or send one as an individual. And if you do send a letter, please let us know. We'd love to know what people are doing. And of course, for those of you who have not already taken the pledge against ageism, please join us at Every Age Counts and be part of this growing social movement. There has been so many good ideas and so much rich chat in today's webinar. We thank you for that. We will follow up with you. But for now, may I thank you for attending today, and we look forward to continuing to work with you. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.